This is the story of a man who recorded his entire life with a video camera. From an unknown young man in a small town to a rock star beloved by an entire generation. This is the story of Shannon Hoon, the frontman of the band Blind Melon. Seemingly overnight, Shannon had it all: fame, money, and a voice admired by millions. He was the man who created one of the most iconic images of the 1990s, a joyful little girl in a bee costume dancing in his music video. But who could have known that this beautiful dream would turn into a nightmare? Away from the stage, the man who brought joy to so many was being tormented by demons no one else could see. The camera in his hand recorded it all. So why would a man who had just become a father, a man at the absolute peak of his fame, end his life on a cold tour bus at only 28 years old? The footage he left behind will give us the answer. So let's press rewind. Let's go back to the very beginning, before the fame and before the tragedy. To understand Shannon Hoon, you have to travel back to the flat, sprawling cornfields of Lafayette, Indiana in the 1970s and 80s. This was the heart of Middle America, a place of quiet industry, high school football, and a pervasive sense of normalcy. For a restless kid with a wild streak and a poet's soul, a place like Lafayette could feel both like a warm blanket and a cage. In Lafayette, stability was a virtue, and risk was suspect. You graduated, you found steady work, you kept your head down. Shannon loved his town and his people, but he could feel himself shrinking inside the quiet. He wasn't chasing fame so much as oxygen, a bigger room to think, to write, to sing without apology. He carried a notebook that filled up with fragments, lines overheard at gas stations, half rhymes from late-night radio, little melodies that didn't fit inside small talk. A hand-me-down guitar stayed within arm's reach of the bed. After homework or a shift, he'd shut the door and play until his fingertips burned, trying to name a feeling that didn't have a name yet. The Midwest gives you two gifts, a work ethic and a ceiling. The ethic told him to show up every day. The ceiling told him he'd outgrow the room if he kept showing up. The more he wrote, the smaller the town felt. Leaving didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like survival, like stepping outside for air after a long time underground. One night, he spread a road atlas across the kitchen table and traced a finger west. Los Angeles wasn't a fantasy so much as a test. Was the voice in his chest real or just a noise in his head? He promised his family he'd call. He promised himself he wouldn't look back until the song sounded like him. When he finally turned the ignition and pointed the car toward the desert, he wasn't fleeing Indiana. He was searching for a stage big enough for the voice in his head. Shannon was a spark of untamable energy. As a teenager, he was a gifted athlete, excelling in football, wrestling, and pole vaulting. But he was also a rebel, with a mischievous grin and a penchant for finding trouble. He was a small-town kid with a big city spirit, a dreamer who felt out of place. He was surrounded by a loving family, especially his mother Nell, who saw the gentle, creative soul beneath the rebellious exterior. But the quiet life was never going to be enough for him. He was filled with a powerful, uncontainable urge to create, to connect, to live a life that was bigger and louder than the one laid out for him. So like countless dreamers before him, he did the only thing he could do. He packed his bags and headed west to the sprawling, chaotic promise of Los Angeles. He arrived in 1990 with little more than a few dollars in his pocket and a head full of songs. He was a long way from the cornfields of Indiana, and he was about to step into a world that would both build him up and tear him down. Los Angeles in the late 1980s was the epicenter of the rock and roll universe, dominated by the slick, hedonistic sounds of glam metal, but a new, grittier sound was starting to bubble up from the underground. It was into this shifting landscape that Shannon Hoon, the kid from Indiana, arrived. He soon connected with two other recent transplants, guitarist Roger Stevens and bassist Brad Smith, who had come from Mississippi with their own musical dreams. There was instant chemistry. Shannon's powerful, soulful voice and poetic lyrics were the perfect complement to their intricate, 70s-inspired rock sound. With the addition of guitarist Christopher Thorne and drummer Glenn Graham, Blind Melon was born. They soon decamped east to Durham, North Carolina, moving into a small house they nicknamed the Sleepy House. There, sealed off from the industry buzz, they honed their unique sound, a warm, psychedelic blend of classic rock, folk, and soul that stood in stark contrast to the aggressive grunge and polished metal of the era. During this time, Shannon had a powerful connection in his corner. His older sister, Anna, was a close friend of another Indiana native who had made it big in L.A. Axl Rose. The Guns N' Roses, GNR, frontman, took a liking to Shannon, inviting him into the studio to sing backing vocals on Don't Cry in the Garden and to appear in the Don't Cry video. This was a huge break, giving Shannon and his new band an invaluable dose of industry credibility, but it also threw him headfirst into the deep end of the rock and roll lifestyle, exposing him to a world of excess that would later become his undoing. Fueled by a powerful demo tape and the buzz from the Guns N' Roses GNR connection, Blind Melon was signed to Capitol Records in 1991. They poured all of their creative energy into their self-titled debut album, a sprawling, beautiful record filled with intricate musicianship and Shannon's deeply personal lyrics. The album was released in 1992 to critical acclaim but slow sales. For a while, it seemed like they might be a band's band, respected by critics but destined to fly under the radar. And then a bee changed everything. The song was No Rain. It was an upbeat, almost childlike tune with a folksy swing that the band themselves never took seriously. It was an inside joke, a song they played for fun. They never thought it would be a single, let alone a hit. But their record label, Capitol Records, heard something special in its infectious melody and insisted. For the music video, the label connected them with director Samuel Bayer, who had just shot the legendary video for Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. Bayer, wanting to do something completely different from the dark angst of Nirvana, came up with a concept that was pure whimsical genius. He envisioned the story of a lonely tap-dancing little girl in a bee costume, played by a 10-year-old Heather DeLoach. In the video, she is laughed at, rejected, ostracized for being different, and a little bit awkward. She wanders the city streets, a solitary figure searching for acceptance. It was a story about being an outsider, a feeling that both the band and millions of young people could deeply relate to. As many observers noted at the time, MTV in 1993 was dominated by grunge. The B-Girl clip landed like a burst of sunlight and tapped a universal outsider fantasy. The video was a phenomenon. In the summer of 1993, you couldn't escape it. It was in constant rotation on MTV, a blast of sunshine and innocence in an era dominated by grunge angst. The B-Girl, played by Heather DeLoach, became an instant icon. And Shannon Hoon, with his long hair, nose ring, and charismatic shaman-like presence, became a reluctant superstar. The song in the video propelled Blind Melon's album into the stratosphere, selling millions of copies and turning them into one of the biggest bands in the world overnight. The fame was sudden, overwhelming, and completely disorienting. One minute they were a struggling band living in a cramped house. The next they were on the cover of Rolling Stone. The pinnacle of this chaotic era came at Woodstock '94. The band took the stage in the middle of a torrential downpour, and Shannon, reportedly under the influence of LSD, appeared wearing his girlfriend's white dress, his hair adorned with barrettes. It was a moment of pure, uninhibited, and chaotic freedom, a perfect snapshot of his wild child spirit. But it was also a sign of the increasing erraticism that was beginning to worry those closest to him. The fame he had dreamed of had finally arrived, but it wasn't a dream. It was a tidal wave, and he was completely unprepared for its force. The world, captivated by the B-girl, was eagerly awaiting No Rain Part 2, but a hangover was coming. The band, and especially Shannon, felt trapped by the sunny, whimsical image that had made them famous. They responded by running in the exact opposite direction. They retreated to New Orleans to record their second album, a record that would be a direct reflection of their chaotic new reality. The album was called Soup. As one music critic later noted, Soup was commercial suicide, and it was artistic genius. It was the sound of a band intentionally killing the golden goose. They were telling the world, we are not the B-girl. The music was complex, jazzy, at times terrifying. And Shannon's lyrics, they went from whimsical observations to raw, uncomfortable confessions about addiction, alienation, and the horror of fame. It was the sound of Shannon Hoon telling everyone, this is who I really am, and it's not always pretty. Released on August 15, 1995, Soup was met with confusion. The jaunty sing-alongs were gone, replaced by dark, sprawling compositions, jarring shifts in tempo, and Shannon's harrowing lyrics about his own unraveling. Produced by Andy Wallace and recorded at Kingsway and Ultrasonic Studios, the album disappointed the label, and many fans turned away. But for those who listened closely, the album was a masterpiece, a brave, brutally honest, and artistically fearless statement. It was the true sound of Blind Melon and the unfiltered voice of Shannon Hoon's beautiful, troubled soul. Here is where Shannon's story takes a unique and profoundly intimate turn. Around the time the band was signed, he bought a Hi8 video camera, and for the next 5 years, he documented everything. This footage, compiled years after his death into the documentary All I Can Say, provides an unprecedented look into the heart and mind of a man on a rocket ride to fame. He filmed the band in the studio on the tour bus in moments of quiet creativity and raucous celebration. But more importantly, he turned the camera on himself. He used it as a video diary, speaking directly to the lens with a raw, unfiltered honesty. We see him as a goofy, funny kid from Indiana, full of wonder and excitement. We see him wrestling with his lyrics, his voice echoing in a lonely hotel room, and we see him grappling with the dark side of his new life. Before we rush to moral judgments, it's worth pausing on what constant high-stress touring actually does to a body. Through his own lens, we witness his struggle with addiction. It wasn't a secret. It was a battle he fought out in the open. The pressures of fame exacerbated the demons he had been fighting for years. His behavior became more erratic, leading to public incidents, including an arrest for indecent exposure in Vancouver in 1993. His bandmates, who were like his brothers, were caught in an impossible situation. How do you help someone who is also your band's biggest asset? They tried everything, from interventions to canceling tours. But the disease had a powerful grip. But the camera also captured the most powerful and hopeful moment of his life. In July 1995, Shannon and his longtime partner Lisa Krause, later known as Lisa Sinha, welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Nico Blue. Shannon filmed the moments leading up to her birth and the instant he first held her in his arms. In that footage, you see a transformation. The wild rock star is gone, replaced by a father filled with an overwhelming sense of love and awe. Nico became his reason to live, his motivation to finally get clean. He checked himself into rehab, and for a time it seemed like he was going to win his battle. He was a doting father, and the love he had for his daughter was a powerful, beautiful thing to witness. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance for a new beginning. The public perception of Shannon Hoon during this time was often simplistic and cruel. To many, he was just another out-of-control rock star, a cliché of drug-fueled excess. The headlines focused on his arrest, his bizarre onstage behavior, and his stints in rehab. It's a narrative that's easy to write, but it completely misses the truth of the man. Addiction isn't a plot twist. It's a physiology. Sleep debt, constant motion, 1,000 hands pulling at one person. That's not a lifestyle, it's a lab condition. On tour, your body clock gets rewritten nightly. You surge with adrenaline at 11 p.m., step off stage at midnight still red-lined, then try to shut it all down inside a moving bus. The brain doesn't flip like a switch, so you negotiate. Something to bring you up before the show, something to slow you down after, something to quiet the noise at 3:17 a.m. That's not character failure. That's chemistry meeting a schedule it was never designed to survive. People love simple stories, the reckless singer, the cautionary tale, but simple stories miss the machinery underneath. The miles stack up, the days blur. The diet is whatever you can grab at a gas station. You sleep in fragments. You wake in new cities you barely see. Then you're asked to be incandescent on cue, to turn hurt into melody and fatigue into joy for 90 minutes, 4 nights in a row. The cost rolls forward. Shannon wasn't trying to be a myth. He was trying to manage a nervous system that kept getting hijacked. Some days he won. On other days, the wheels of the routine, stimulation, sedation, repeat rolled right over him. If you only judge the outcomes, you call it excess. If you watch the inputs, you call it exposure. Ultimately, it isn't a story about morals. It's a story about physiology, about a body and a brain pushed past their limits again and again under very bright lights. The controversy surrounding him wasn't about a moral failing. It was about a man engaged in a life or death struggle with the disease of addiction. His bandmates weren't enablers. They were desperate friends trying to save him. For the tour supporting their second, much darker and more complex album, Soup, they took a drastic step. They hired a full-time drug counselor to accompany Shannon on the road, a sober companion whose only job was to keep him safe. This is a rarely discussed detail that speaks volumes about the reality of the situation. This wasn't a party. This was a medical crisis unfolding in real time on a tour bus. For a while it worked, but the pull of the addiction was relentless. Early in the tour, Shannon, feeling confident he could handle it on his own, sent the counselor home. It was a fatal decision. On October 20th, 1995, Blind Melon played a show at Numbers in Houston, Texas. Shannon was clearly not well. After the show, the band boarded their tour bus and headed for their next gig in New Orleans. During the night, after a reported cocaine binge, Shannon settled into his bunk. The final moments of a life often arrive not with a dramatic roar, but in a profound and mundane quiet. So it was on the morning of October 21st, 1995. The Blind Melon tour bus, a rolling sanctuary and prison that had carried the band across America, was parked off St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans, a city famous for both its vibrant music and its seductive excesses. Inside, the usual post-show silence hung in the air, but as the day began, one bunk remained still. When the band's sound engineer, Lyle Eves, went to check on Shannon Hoon, he found him unresponsive, his vibrant, chaotic energy finally stilled. The paramedics were called, but it was a formality. Richard Shannon Hoon, a man who seemed to contain a universe of untamed life, was pronounced dead at the scene from a cocaine overdose. He was just 28 years old. And back home, the daughter he had dreamed of, Nico Blue, was just over 14 weeks old. A life just beginning as his had so tragically ended. The news of his death rippled across the headlines with a heartbreaking sense of inevitability. To a public that had watched his tumultuous life play out in the pages of magazines and on MTV News, it was a tragic but not entirely surprising end. In the narrative of the 1990s, his name was sadly but seamlessly added to the growing list of brilliant, sensitive artists lost to the pressures of fame and addiction. He was placed alongside Kurt Cobain and Lane Staley as another voice of a generation silenced by the very demons their music so often explored. But this simple, tragic narrative, while true on the surface, failed to capture the immense and specific loss felt by those who truly knew him, and by the fans who had looked past the headlines to see the gentle, brilliant, and utterly unique artistic soul at the core of the chaos. For those inside his circle, the loss was immeasurable, precisely because they knew the man behind the rock and roll caricature. They didn't just lose a singer, they lost Shannon, the goofy, often childlike friend with a deep love for nature and an almost painful degree of emotional honesty. They lost the artist whose lyrics were not just angsty rock poetry, but raw, unfiltered diary entries about his own struggles, hopes, and fears. For his bandmates, they lost their brother and their creative center, the unpredictable force of nature that gave their music its dangerous, beautiful edge. The public saw a cliché fulfilled, but his loved ones felt the universe tear a hole in their lives. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the public's memory of Blind Melon seemed to shrink, collapsing down to a single song and a single image. They were largely remembered as a one-hit wonder, a band forever defined by the sunny psychedelic folk of No Rain and the inescapable iconic video of the Little Bee Girl. This label was both a blessing and a curse. It had made them famous, but it had also created a profound misunderstanding of who they were as a band. The Bee Girl became a cultural touchstone, but her cheerful, innocent dance overshadowed the darker, more complex soul of the band's music. But the most significant shift in Shannon Hoon's legacy came in 2019, with the release of All I Can Say. The documentary, meticulously crafted from hundreds of hours, roughly 200, of his own high-8 video footage, was a revelation. For the first time, the world was able to see Shannon not as a caricature, but as he saw himself, a funny, intelligent, sensitive, and deeply conflicted human being. The film allowed him to tell his own story posthumously. It humanized him in a way no biography or magazine article ever could. It wasn't a story about him, it was a story by him. It's a raw, beautiful, and ultimately heartbreaking self-portrait that stands as one of the most intimate and honest rock documentaries ever made. It cemented his legacy not just as a musician, but as the director of his own story. The camera he used to find the truth finally told his. Shannon Hoon's story is a profound and intimate look at the human cost of sudden fame and the devastating reality of addiction. Through the lens of his own camera, he left behind a gift, a raw, unfiltered look into a life lived with incredible passion, joy, and pain. For a brief moment, he was a star who burned incredibly bright, illuminating the world with a voice that was entirely his own, all while the camera was rolling. He wasn't just the singer of No Rain. He was a poet from Indiana, a loving father, and an artist who, for a few brilliant years, turned his camera on his own life and invited the world to watch. His story is a heartbreaking reminder that behind every public persona is a fragile human being, and his own footage is his final, lasting word, a testament to a beautiful, chaotic, and all too brief existence. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And please subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of the human experience. Thank you for watching.